At 6:30 on March 1, 1943, Major Ed Laner stood on a rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby and watched his B-25 Mitchell bomber crews prepare for a mission that higher command had already labeled impossible. He was 31 years old with 72 combat missions and 0 ships sunk. The Japanese had sent 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers from Rabaul carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers to reinforce their base at Lae. American intelligence had intercepted the convoy departure. Every transport that reached Lae meant another division the Allies would have to fight in the jungle with heavy losses. Laner faced a clear problem. Traditional bombing from 10,000 feet gave ships enough time to turn away. Japanese captains observed American bombers climbing to altitude, calculated the bomb path and steered clear of the impact area. 5th Air Force B-7s had been attacking Japanese convoys for 8 months with a hit rate of only 3%. Most bombs exploded in open ocean while the ships continued forward. The numbers were harsh. A 1,000 pounds bomb dropped from altitude needed 37 seconds to reach the water. In that time, a destroyer moving at 30 knots could travel 380 yards, which is more than 3 football fields. The bombardier aimed at the ship's position, but the bomb landed where the ship had already moved away. Laner had seen this outcome again and again. Bombers returned with accurate photographs showing tight patterns around ships but not on them. Crews reported direct hits that were actually near misses. The Japanese fleet kept moving while American losses increased. His squadron had lost 4 aircraft in the past month during convoy attacks, which meant 40 men. Japanese defenses were precise. Their gunners tracked bombers at high altitude, calculated lead and filled the sky with flak. By the time bombs were released, many aircraft were already damaged or destroyed. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force, suggested a method that sounded unrealistic to many pilots. Skip the bomb across the water like a flat stone. Fly at 50 feet and release the bomb 300 yards from the target with a 5-second delay fuse. The bomb would bounce once or twice, then strike the ship and detonate on contact or just below the waterline. The idea seemed workable in theory but dangerous in practice. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet above the ocean directly toward a heavily armed ship went against every survival instinct Laner had developed. Japanese destroyers carried 127mm guns, 25mm cannons and multiple lighter weapons. All of them could target a bomber at that height. One hit to the engine could send a B-25 crashing into the sea instantly. Higher command had rejected this tactic twice, calling it too dangerous and untested. Laner's request to train for skip bombing was denied in December and again in January. The official response described it as a risk to both equipment and personnel. Air crews were instructed to continue using high-altitude bombing methods. However, those methods were not producing results. Laner moved to the operations tent and placed reconnaissance photos on the planning table. The Japanese convoy had been seen at dawn moving southeast through the Bismarck Sea. 8 large transports were arranged in 2 columns with destroyers guarding the sides. Every ship carried soldiers, artillery and ammunition. If these transports reached Lae, the campaign in New Guinea would continue for another year. He had an idea that could either prove Kenney's belief in low-altitude attacks or result in the loss of 60 American aircrew before midday. The convoy would move within striking range at 0900, which left only 3 hours to prepare and 3 hours to train his pilots in a method they had never used before. Laner gathered his squadron leaders inside the tent and explained the plan that had previously been denied. The B-25 Mitchell had not been built for this role. It was designed for medium-altitude bombing using a level approach. Its twin Wright Cyclone engines could reach 300 miles per hour in level flight, but that speed offered little protection if Japanese gunners had enough time to track the aircraft. Kenney's modification changed the situation. Mechanics from the 5th Air Force had removed the bombardier section in the nose and installed 850 caliber machine guns facing forward. 4 were placed in the nose and 4 along the fuselage sides. The B-25 had become a forward-firing gun platform capable of delivering 200 rounds per second into a target. The concept was direct. Suppress the ship's anti-aircraft defenses during the approach and force enemy gunners to take cover or risk exposure. Lehner had observed the installation of these weapons 3 weeks earlier. The added weight of 1,200 pounds shifted the center of gravity forward. The aircraft was no longer a standard bomber. It now operated as a hybrid between an attack aircraft and a maritime strike fighter which had not existed in this form before. Training flights were carried out quietly. Kenny had located a wreck named the Pruth, which was a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nader Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The remains of the ship were partly submerged and provided a suitable target. Lehner's crews practiced at dawn and dusk when visibility was limited and attention was minimal. They learned to fly just above the wave tops at 270 miles per hour. They practiced timing the bomb release and also saw the results of errors. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett made a mistake on February 16. He approached at 70 feet instead of 50. The bomb skipped twice past over the target and exploded 300 yards beyond the wreck. His bombardier Sergeant Mike Russo adjusted the calculations and advised a lower, faster approach with a closer release point. On the next attempt, Fawcett flew at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and struck the hull just below the waterline, which is where a ship's magazine would be located and where a single explosion could destroy a vessel. However, the wreck did not return fire. Lehner placed reconnaissance images on the briefing table and indicated the lead transport, which was 800 feet long with a displacement of 10,000 tons and the capacity to carry 1,500 troops. It served as the convoy flagship. Every officer present understood the importance of the mission. Japanese reinforcements had already made the Buna campaign a prolonged and costly operation with 5,000 Allied casualties. Leh would present an even greater challenge if the transports reached their destination. Skip bombing required accuracy that most bomber crews had not attempted before. The approach had to be maintained at 50 feet above the water with a speed of 270 miles per hour. The release point had to be at 300 yards with a trajectory angle of 8 degrees and a delay fuse of 5 seconds. Any deviation could result in failure, where the bomb might pass over the ship, detonate too early, or sink without exploding. Lehner assigned each pilot a specific target from Transport 1 through Transport 8. Destroyers were designated as secondary targets if the transports were already disabled. No aircraft would attack the same target twice. The plan focused on efficiency and impact with one pass, one bomb, and one opportunity. At 0700 the crews moved to their aircraft. There were 54 men assigned to 9 B-25 bombers. In support, 13 Beaufort fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would begin by strafing the convoy to reduce anti-aircraft fire. Above them, 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would conduct high-altitude bombing to disrupt formation and force maneuvering. P-38 Lightning fighters would engage Japanese Zero aircraft at higher altitude. The primary strike would come from Lehner's 9 bombers flying at 50 feet. He entered his aircraft at 0715. His co-pilot Lieutenant Tom Benz was completing the pre-flight checklist while the Bombardier Staff Sergeant Carl Walls checked the release mechanism repeatedly. The crew remained silent. They had operated together for 9 months and understood the risk of a low-altitude attack. Lehner started the port engine followed by the starboard engine. The engine stabilized as 8 other B-25 aircraft prepared nearby. The formation would depart in groups of 3 with Lehner leading the first group. They would remain low over the water during the entire flight to avoid detection, since Japanese radar could not track aircraft below 100 feet. This element of surprise was essential. At 0745 Lehner released the brakes and began takeoff. Within a few hours he would learn whether Kenny's method was effective or if the mission had led his squadron into heavy losses. The flight to the Bismarck Sea required 90 minutes. Lehner kept his formation at 30 feet above the ocean, which was low enough for spray from the wave tops to reach his windscreen. The B-25 aircraft flew in a loose V formation with each plane separated by 200 yards. This spacing allowed visual contact while reducing the risk that a single burst of flak could damage more than one bomber. Radio silence was maintained because the Japanese monitored frequencies and any transmission could reveal their approach. Surprise was more valuable than coordination. Laner checked his watch at 0830. The convoy was expected to be 60 miles northeast, moving at 12 knots toward the Vitiaz Strait. According to reconnaissance, the timing was correct, but the ocean below appeared empty. There were no visible signs of ships or patrol boats, only open water extending to the horizon. At such a low altitude, visibility was limited to about 5 miles, so navigation had to be exact. A small error in course could result in missing the target or approaching from a direction that allowed destroyers to respond with full firepower. At 0852, Laner observed smoke on the horizon, which indicated the presence of multiple ships. The dark exhaust from 16 vessels confirmed the convoy position. He activated his throat microphone briefly with a single click to signal his formation and received the same response from his wingmen. Radio discipline was maintained. As they moved closer, the convoy became clear with 2 columns of transports and 4 ships in each column. Destroyers were positioned ahead and along the flanks to provide protection. Laner identified gun positions on the nearest destroyer and noted multiple main turrets along with numerous smaller weapons that would soon engage. At 0857, the Beaufort aircraft began their attack. From a distance of 3 miles, Laner watched 13 Australian planes dive from the northeast and fire their cannons across the decks of the destroyers. Tracers moved across the water as Japanese anti-aircraft guns shifted focus toward this new threat. This action followed the plan, since the Beaufort aircraft were meant to distract rather than destroy. Shortly after, the B-17 bombers arrived at 10,000 feet and released their bombs toward the convoy. Japanese ships responded by maneuvering sharply, which disrupted their formation and increased spacing between vessels. Destroyers accelerated and created visible wake behind them. This reaction introduced confusion, which supported the attack plan. Laner reduced throttle and descended further to 40 feet while adjusting speed to 260 miles per hour. His bombardier walls provided distance updates starting from 400 yards and counting down steadily. The ships were now clearly visible, and Laner selected the second transport in the port column as his target. It was about 700 feet long and heavily loaded, which made it a suitable objective. His aim was directed toward the central section where troops were concentrated. A destroyer on the left side detected the approaching aircraft and began firing. Laner observed muzzle flashes as shells were launched toward his formation, but they passed above because the gunners were still adjusting to the low-altitude approach. At a distance of 2,000 yards, Laner opened fire with all 8 forward machine guns. Continuous tracer fire struck the transport structure, causing visible damage as glass broke and metal surfaces reacted to impact. Men on deck dropped or moved quickly for cover. The suppression was effective. Anti-aircraft crews could not return fire while continuous rounds struck their positions at high speed. At 1,200 yards, Laner's wingmen began to spread out, with each bomber aligning on its assigned target. The formation separated by design. 9 bombers moved toward 9 ships at the same time. This left the defenders with no time to adjust their fire or organize a response. At 800 yards, the destroyer fired again. This time the shells landed close to Laner's formation on both sides. The blast was strong enough to shake the aircraft. Fragments struck the fuselage. Ben, the co-pilot, reported damage and noted that the port engine oil pressure was dropping but still within safe limits. At 600 yards, the transport filled Laner's view. He could see soldiers on deck moving for protection. He could see the bridge windows and gun crews turning their weapons toward his aircraft. The situation placed pressure on his decision-making, as instinct suggested climbing away from the threat ahead. The closing speed of both aircraft and ship created a narrow margin for action. At 400 yards, walls confirmed that the bomb was armed and ready. At 300 yards, Laner released the bomb. The aircraft shifted upward as the weight dropped away. The bomb moved forward with momentum, struck the water and skipped once before continuing toward the hull of the transport. Laner pulled back on the controls and climbed. The 5-second delay fuse was active. The detonation occurred at the waterline. Laner did not see the moment of impact but felt the force. The shock wave hit the aircraft and pushed it off balance. Ben worked to stabilize control as the altitude increased through 100, then 200, then 300 feet. Laner looked back briefly. The transport was breaking apart. Fire and smoke rose from the center section. The hull showed severe structural damage and secondary explosions followed as stored ammunition ignited. The ship began to tilt and take on water through the damaged area. Soldiers were leaving the vessel and entering the sea. The results showed that one bomb within seconds could cause critical destruction. The skip bombing method proved effective. To Laner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett completed his attack and pulled away while another transport was burning with flames rising from its forward section. On the left, Captain Bill Hayes released his bomb on a destroyer. The bomb skipped twice and struck below the rear turret. The explosion lifted the stern out of the water. When it settled again, a large section of the rear was gone. The destroyer began to sink quickly from the back. Within the first 90 seconds 4 targets had been hit. The convoy entered a state of disorder, but the defenders began to respond. A destroyer on the far side turned toward the bombers and fired its main guns rapidly. The shells moved across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards, the second by 20, and the third made contact. Mitchell's aircraft broke apart. The bomb under the fuselage detonated on impact and the explosion destroyed the bomber immediately. There were no parachutes and no survivors. 5 men were lost within seconds. Laner observed debris spreading across the water but had no time to react. The attack continued and the remaining B-25 aircraft pressed forward. Lieutenant Carl Johnson aligned his bomber on the lead transport, which served as the convoy flagship. His approach followed the required method at 50 feet and 270 miles per hour with machine guns firing. The Japanese crew responded with full defensive fire, including cannons, heavy machine guns and rifles. The airspace between Johnson and the target was filled with tracer fire. His bomb release was accurate. The weapon skipped once and entered the hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse allowed it to move deep inside before detonation. The explosion passed through multiple decks and caused fire in the cargo areas. Laner understood the contents, which included ammunition, artillery shells and fuel. The transport was set ablaze. Personnel on deck moved into the water as the situation worsened. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber was hit during its approach. A Japanese gunner had adjusted to the low-altitude tactic and 20 mm round struck Warren's port wing. Fuel leaked from the damaged tank, but he maintained course. At 300 yards, then 200 and finally 150, he released the bomb. It skipped and struck the transport below the waterline. Warren turned right while trailing fire. His co-pilot Lieutenant Dave Miller activated the fire control system. The flames were reduced and the aircraft remained in operation with difficulty. At this stage 6 transports were burning or sinking and 2 destroyers were damaged while 1 B-25 had been lost. The initial attack lasted 4 minutes. A second wave approached with 9 additional B-25 aircraft from the 90th Bomb Squadron led by Major Ralph Chell. They had observed the first attack from a distance and confirmed the method was effective while understanding the losses involved. Chell's formation spread out with each bomber selecting a target among the remaining ships. The Japanese forces were now prepared. All available guns were directed at low-altitude targets and the destroyers formed a defensive line while firing in coordinated patterns. The water surface was disturbed by repeated shell impacts. The response was controlled and intense as the Japanese adjusted their defense. Chell approached from the east using the position of the sun to reduce visibility for the defenders. This limited the accuracy of enemy fire. His bomb struck a transport that was already damaged and accelerated its sinking. The vessel rolled and submerged in less than 2 minutes with a large number of soldiers on board. Lieutenant Harold Jensen did not achieve the same result. His approach was too shallow and too fast. The bombs skipped multiple times past beyond the destroyer and detonated without effect. Jensen attempted a second run, but the targeted destroyer tracked his movement. On the return pass, the first shell disabled the port engine and the second struck the cockpit. His B-25 inverted and impacted the sea at high speed. The aircraft was lost without explosion. 2 bombers had been destroyed while 7 transports were sinking and 3 destroyers were severely damaged. After 8 minutes of engagement, Laner recognized that Japanese fighter aircraft were still expected in the area. At 0915, a group of 18 Zero fighters descended from 12,000 feet. Laner observed them through cloud cover moving rapidly toward the bombers. P-38 Lightning fighters were assigned to intercept but were not fully effective at that moment. This indicated either an imbalance in numbers or the presence of additional Japanese aircraft. Laner's B-25 was in a vulnerable condition with limited fuel and reduced ammunition. The forward guns had approximately 200 rounds remaining, which was insufficient for extended combat. He increased power and reduced altitude further to near the water surface. The propellers produced spray as the aircraft moved at very low height. The Japanese fighters divided into 2 groups. One group engaged the P-38 aircraft while the other moved toward the bombers. They approached at high speed and fired cannons from a distance. Laner observed tracer rounds passing close to his aircraft and adjusted direction to reduce exposure. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake operated the dorsal turret and fired controlled bursts at a nearby fighter, which caused it to break away. However, not all aircraft were able to avoid damage. Lieutenant Warren's already damaged bomber remained at risk. A-0 locked onto his tail and maintained position. Warren attempted multiple evasive actions, including climbs, dives and sharp turns that placed additional strain on his damaged wing. These efforts were not effective. The Zero pilot maintained control and waited until Warren lost speed during a climbing turn, then fired a short burst. Warren's starboard engine failed and the bomber descended into the ocean. Laner observed 3 parachutes, which meant 3 out of 5 crew survived. This was a limited outcome under the circumstances. The Zero fighters continued their attack for 6 minutes before breaking off and climbing. Laner understood the reason when he saw the B-17 bombers returning for another pass at 10,000 feet. The Japanese fighters had to decide between engaging the low-flying bombers or defending the convoy from high-altitude threats. They shifted focus to the higher-level bombers, which allowed Laner a brief opportunity to assess his situation. His port engine was operating unevenly with unstable oil pressure and the fuel level showed 60%, which was likely enough to return to Port Moresby. He looked back at the convoy and confirmed that 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already destroyed, while the 8th remained on fire and was moving toward the New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers assigned to screening duty were damaged. 2 were no longer moving, while the other 2 circled the damaged transports to recover survivors. The engagement at the Bismarck Sea was still ongoing. It was 0921, and although the initial attack lasted 11 minutes, further operations would continue for several days. American aircraft would return at regular intervals and smaller naval units would search the area. The convoy had carried 7,000 troops and fewer than 1,200 were expected to reach Leh. The remainder would not survive due to combat damage or exposure. Laner set a course for return. His formation was dispersed across a wide area of ocean. 4 bombers had been lost and 20 crew members were dead or missing. Despite these losses, the mission achieved its objective. Skip bombing had demonstrated effectiveness and would be adopted widely across the Pacific theater. Within months, Japanese command would avoid moving large convoys within range of Allied aircraft, which would limit their supply lines and influence the course of the conflict. At that moment, Laner focused on reaching base. His fuel level continued to drop and the engine condition worsened, while the distance to Port Moresby remained significant. He instructed his crew to discard non-essential equipment, including unused ammunition, tools and spare parts, to reduce weight. The B-25 struggled to maintain altitude with one engine operating poorly. At 1010, Ben identified land, which was the southern coast of New Guinea. Their course was correct, but the aircraft condition was deteriorating. The port engine showed severe vibration with oil leaking and temperature increasing beyond safe limits. Lehner shut down the failing engine and transferred power to the remaining engine. The aircraft slowed to about 180 miles per hour, which was close to minimum flight speed but sufficient to remain airborne. The coastline approached gradually and the engine continued to operate. Lehner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. Ground crews, mechanics and intelligence personnel were present along the runway as information about the attack had already spread. He stopped the engines and remained in the cockpit briefly while maintaining control position. His co-pilot stayed silent. The flight duration was 3 hours and 42 minutes, which felt much longer under the conditions. The debrief continued for 2 hours. Lehner and the surviving pilots remained in the operations area while intelligence staff collected details through repeated questioning. They asked about the number of ships struck, the number sinking, the bombs released and the aircraft losses. The goal was to build a complete assessment. 9 pilots had conducted the attack and 5 returned. Mitchell and Jensen were confirmed lost while Warren had survived after being recovered by a Catalina flying boat. 2 crew members were injured. Reconnaissance images arrived at 1,300 hours. An Australian Beaufort aircraft had captured photographs of the convoy from 15,000 feet at midday. The images confirmed the outcome that the crews had reported. 8 transports were identified with 7 sunk or in the process of sinking, while the 8th was grounded on the New Britain coast and burning. 4 destroyers were recorded with 2 sunk and 2 heavily damaged and withdrawing toward Rabaul. The total time from the first attack to the final destruction of ships was 3 hours. General Kenny arrived at Port Moresby at 1,600 hours and went directly to the operations area. He reviewed the reconnaissance images without formal remarks and pointed to the remaining burning transport on the coast. He ordered that it be destroyed completely. Australian Beaufort aircraft would conduct another attack at dusk to ensure that no vessel reached Lae. The second strike began at 17:30. Lehner did not participate because his aircraft required engine replacement. He remained on the runway and observed 9 additional B-25 aircraft depart toward the target as daylight decreased. The Japanese survivors attempted to recover what they could from the beach and damaged transports. They did not expect another attack, and that assumption proved incorrect. The strike returned at 2,000 hours. The beached transport was no longer afloat and had sunk at its position. The 2 damaged destroyers were intercepted while attempting to withdraw, and both were hit and began sinking. The Japanese operation had started with 16 ships, and by the evening of March 2, 14 were lost in the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers reached Rabaul around midnight in a heavily damaged state. The loss of life was severe. Around 7,000 Japanese soldiers had departed from Rabaul. Reconnaissance over the following 2 days identified about 900 survivors reaching the New Britain coast by lifeboat or by swimming. American PT boats intercepted many of these vessels. Some individuals were taken prisoner while others were killed in the water. The line between combat and excess force became unclear during those 3 days. Orders were given to deny survival. Reports indicated that Japanese forces had fired on American air crews descending by parachute, and American forces responded with similar actions against personnel in lifeboats. Lehner learned about these events several days later and chose not to seek further details. The conditions of the conflict had changed and formal rules were no longer consistently followed. These actions were not formally recorded in operational reports, but they occurred during the engagement. The final assessment was completed on March 7. Japanese losses included 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,000 troops were lost at sea and another 1,500 were killed by air attacks. About 1,200 reached Lae through jungle routes without equipment or organization and were no longer effective as a fighting force. The reinforcement mission failed completely. American losses included 4 B-25 aircraft, 1 B-17 and 2 P-38 with 13 crew members killed and 6 wounded. Compared to the scale of the convoy, the outcome was heavily in favor of the American forces. Skip bombing proved effective but required crews to approach at very low altitude under intense fire. The level of risk involved was extreme and required precise execution. General Kenny described the battle as a decisive air-sea engagement in the Pacific, while Admiral Yamamoto referred to it as a major loss. The Japanese Navy responded by canceling future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based aircraft. Supply routes to New Guinea were disrupted, which placed pressure on garrisons at Les Salamaua and Madong. These positions were left to operate with limited resources. The battle also influenced air warfare methods. Skip bombing was further developed by American forces and later adopted by British and Soviet units. By 1944, low-altitude bombing became a standard method for attacking maritime targets across multiple air forces. Lehner completed 16 additional missions before returning home in May. He did not publicly discuss the battle or provide personal accounts. His role was limited to operational execution. A remaining question was whether the same tactic would succeed against a prepared opponent. The Japanese addressed this question 3 months later. On June 3, 1943, reconnaissance identified another convoy at Rabaul consisting of 6 transports and 8 destroyers. This time the ships traveled at night and maintained continuous air cover with 60 Zero fighters. Destroyers were equipped with additional 20 mm anti-aircraft guns positioned to counter low-altitude attacks. The 5th Air Force attacked at dawn using 12 B-25 aircraft with skip bombing. The results showed reduced effectiveness. 2 transports were hit and 1 destroyer damaged, while 3 B-25 aircraft were lost. The defensive improvements had increased effectiveness. Gun crews adjusted to track low-altitude targets and concentrated fire during the final approach phase when bombers had limited maneuver options. American forces responded with further modifications. By July, additional armor was installed around critical areas such as cockpit and engines. Forward-firing weapons were increased to 12 50 caliber machine guns and in some cases up to 14. The approach remained consistent by using heavy fire to suppress defenses during the attack. These adjustments improved outcomes. On November 2, 1943, a formation of 38 B-25 aircraft conducted a large-scale strike on Rabaul Harbor using skip bombing. The harbor contained multiple naval and merchant vessels. Many ships were hit, including a heavy cruiser and a destroyer, which were sunk along with auxiliary vessels, and numerous merchant ships damaged. The operation lasted 18 minutes and American losses were limited to 2 B-25 aircraft. The effectiveness had improved again, but also highlighted that skip bombing was most effective in confined waters where ships had limited maneuver space. In open ocean conditions with active air cover, the tactic remained high risk. In controlled environments such as harbors, it produced significant damage. The British adopted skip bombing later in 1943. Royal Air Force Beaufort aircraft using this method attacked German convoys near Norway. The outcomes reflected similar patterns, with strong impact on targets but also notable losses among attacking aircraft. The Germans responded by increasing anti-aircraft weapons on their merchant ships and requiring convoys to operate under strong fighter escort. This raised the cost of transporting supplies by sea and reduced overall efficiency. The Soviets also applied skip bombing against German vessels in the Black Sea and Baltic regions. Their approach was less refined, with lower altitude, heavier bombs and limited suppressive fire. The outcomes were mixed, with some ships destroyed but many bombers lost. The Soviet crews showed determination but lacked the level of training and technical development that American forces had achieved through experience in the Pacific. By 1944, skip bombing had developed into a more advanced system. American operations now used coordinated attacks where high-altitude bombers struck first to force ships into evasive movement. Fighter aircraft followed by suppressing anti-aircraft defenses. Skip bombers then approached at low altitude while defenses were distracted and disorganized. This layered method reduced losses and maintained effectiveness. The results supported this shift. From March 1943 to August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or heavily damaged 212 Japanese vessels while losing 47 bombers. This created a ratio of about 4.5 ships for each bomber lost. In comparison, high-altitude bombing achieved about 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing proved far more effective. However, the human impact remained significant. Crews had to fly directly toward armed ships while maintaining steady approach under continuous fire. The stress levels were high. Pilots assigned to these missions often completed shorter tours and experienced higher levels of fatigue with increased medical removal due to stress-related conditions. The method was effective but placed heavy strain on the crews involved. Lehner did not conduct skip bombing missions after May 1943. Instead, he trained new pilots and observed them depart on missions using the technique he helped establish. Some did not return. By the end of the war, he had trained 62 pilots in skip bombing. Of these, 18 were killed and 23 wounded. This represented a fatality rate of 29% and a total casualty rate of 66%. These figures were better than high-altitude bombing but still among the highest in combat aviation roles. Historians later debated whether skip bombing shortened the war. The conclusion remains complex. The method did not secure victory on its own, but it significantly reduced Japanese supply capabilities and made reinforcement operations difficult. Without supplies, defensive positions weakened and became unsustainable. Island positions were lost gradually as a result. What remains clear is that in early March 1943 a small group of B-25 bombers flying at very low altitude destroyed a major Japanese convoy within minutes of sustained combat. The method had been rejected earlier and considered too dangerous, yet it proved effective when executed by crews willing to accept extreme risk. The aircraft used in the Bismarck Sea attack were later removed from service and none were preserved specifically as museum examples. Major Ed Lehner returned to the United States in June 1943 at the age of 31 after completing 88 combat missions. He had survived longer than many bomber pilots in the Pacific Theater. The Army Air Force requested that he continue training new crews and share his experience, but he declined. Instead, he transferred to transport operations and flew C-47 aircraft for the remainder of the war, carrying supplies and personnel. He avoided further combat missions and did not participate in skip bombing again. His decision was understood within command, as some personnel continued combat operations while others chose different roles after extended exposure to combat conditions. Lehner was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943 and accepted after initially declining. His focus remained on completing service rather than recognition. He left military service after Japan surrendered in 1945 and received awards including the Distinguished Flying Cross Air Medals and a Purple Heart for injuries that had not been formally reported. He died in 1997 in Sacramento, California at the age of 85. His obituary mentioned military service briefly without reference to the Battle of the Bismarck Sea or skip bombing. He had requested that these details not be discussed publicly and his family respected that choice. General George Kenney received recognition in historical accounts for the development of skip bombing, which aligned with his role in proposing the concept. Lehner's contribution was in proving its effectiveness through operational use. This distinction was relevant to historians but less important to the crews involved. The B-25 Mitchell became widely recognized partly due to its role in skip bombing operations. It served in multiple theaters during the war but gained its reputation in the Pacific, where it carried out missions that involved high risk. By the end of the conflict, B-25 aircraft had destroyed more enemy shipping than any other bomber type. The technique developed during the Bismarck Sea engagement became standard practice for B-25 units in the Pacific. No surviving museum aircraft can be directly linked to the Bismarck Sea battle. Most were retired and dismantled after the war. Some examples remain in museums in restored or static condition. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio and the Smithsonian both display B-25 aircraft, though none participated in that specific engagement. The battle itself is not widely known outside military history. It lacks the recognition of other major engagements and was not widely represented in media. Documentation exists through operational reports, reconnaissance imagery, and accounts from participants who often chose not to share their experiences. The key outcome is that in March 1943 American bomber crews demonstrated that aircraft could effectively attack ships at low altitude using skip bombing. The method was initially considered too dangerous but later recognized as an effective tactical innovation. It represented a combination of necessity and adaptation where existing methods had failed. The approach required maintaining course under intense defensive fire and relied on discipline and coordination. Following the Bismarck Sea engagement, Japanese convoys avoided operating within range of Allied aircraft, which disrupted supply lines and weakened forward positions. While skip bombing did not alone determine the outcome of the war, it contributed to limiting the operational capability of Japanese forces. If this account was useful, consider supporting the channel by engaging with the content. Each interaction helps expand visibility and allows more historical material to reach a wider audience. You can subscribe and enable notifications to stay updated with similar content. Sharing your location or connection to military history can also contribute to the discussion and keep these events remembered.